Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Books. My dad, who has a PhD in English literature, thinks I should read because reading them improves my understanding of good literature. Also known as Gwen aimlessly chatters about real literature. So, what is real literature this week? Real literature this week is a historical novel, not, as is my wont, usually historical fantasy, but actual history. And the thing about this is that as historical fiction, the important thing to remember is that real historical fiction very much tends to be, here's all the things that were happening, and here's what somebody might have said or might have thought in the middle of whatever it is that that was going on historically. So the interesting thing about this, though, is that this is, and again, I never do research, so I don't know, although given the nature of the kind of historical novel and the kind of historical novelist that this author is, Dorothy Dunnett's King Hereafter is very specifically telling the story of the so-called real Macbeth. Because the thing you have to remember about Shakespeare is that Shakespeare did historical plays where he talked about, supposedly things that had actually happened in history. And he stole a lot of stories from other people. The reason that we like Shakespeare is because Shakespeare was a brilliant writer, not because he was the man who came up with the most creative and newest ideas of all time. But King Hereafter, in certain ways, it rehabilitates Macbeth, historically, because the thing about Macbeth, one of those plays that many of us were forced to read when we were in high school, is it's a play about what happens when greed gets the better of you, when a good man is given power and opportunities and basically lets it carry him too far, and it turns his head and he becomes something other than a good man. That's very much a central part of the tragedy of Macbeth. The thing about King Hereafter is that King Hereafter it's a story about about a man who is perhaps not the best person he could be, but he's a very, very good king in the end. And what it is it's almost like a real history version of all of those stories where if only they had left the protagonist alone, none of this would have happened. The book opens with Thorfinn, the man who comes to be known, at least in some circles, although not in this book, as Macbeth. His foster father, that he's sort of under the auspices of one man, but his mother has married some other man, and the man who is his actual, and the man who has married his mother and has been raising him in any event, that man winds up being burned to death, and Thorfinn, young, almost innocent Thorfinn, goes rushing to Norway, even though he's only 13. He goes rushing off to Norway because he wants to make sure that, if nothing else, he doesn't lose Orkney. because he is supposed to have part of the island of Orkney, and his stepfather has just been burned to death practically in front of him. He's barely escaped with his life. And it's the start of a career spent politicking. And his foster father, Thorkel Fostri, because he's raised to be a Viking. He's raised to be a Northman, even though, as he puts it at later points in the story, 3/4 of his family is actually Celtic, or is actually Scottish. He's raised to be a Viking, and in the first part of this book, his first love is being on the sea and traveling around and being on his boat, and it's one of the things that grieves him sorely by the end of the book that he can't do that anymore. But the interesting thing is, he schemes and he plots and he works so very hard to get Orkney back, and then his stepfather's lands at Canis, he wants them back too, because they were taken from his mother and stepfather. And so he wants them back, as well as the fact that it's the other side of the straits, and so he wants that land for the sake of protecting Orkney. But over the course of this, he winds up taking revenge on the people who murdered his stepfather. And that revenge that he takes winds up causing him to be married to the woman whose family has Moray, which gets him a foothold in Scotland. And throughout this book, piece by piece, he annexes and fights his way to taking Scotland, not because at any point in his life he had particularly dreamed of it, but because the opportunity arose and he would take it because it was there, and because he loved playing politics. There's a lot of playing politics in this book, a lot of medieval politics, the northern Scottish, Norwegian, Danish politics, a lot of going back and forth, a lot of church politics. And I don't mean church politics as in how the church functions in and of itself, but given the fact that during the Middle Ages the church was a political force in and of itself, that the church had its own governmental powers to be exercised over people. And so you had to play politics with the church, because the church would have such an important and fundamental impact on how your own country developed. And throughout this book, there's this overwhelming cleverness, this Odyssean cleverness of somebody who is just smart and perspicacious and sees through people and predicts people and understands things. And he's able to adapt and roll with things as the unexpected happens, until you get to the end of the book where things stack upon things, stack upon things, stack upon things, and he makes one mistake here, and his foster father, Thorkel Fostri, who has been looking after Orkney for him ever since he became King of Scotland by a sort of an enforced general acclamation, makes one mistake, and all of a sudden they all build up. And the end of this book it's simultaneously triumphant and tragic, because on the one hand, it's tragic because we've all come to care as deeply for Thorfinn Macbeth as all of these people who were his greatest supporters and advisors and everything else. They've all come to care deeply for him because he seems to be a man who cares deeply and does his best to do what is right for his people. And so it's a tragedy because you're seeing somebody who dies at the end in this foolish, unfortunate single combat, in all of the terrible things that happened. It's a tragedy because it's the sort of thing that shouldn't have happened. But at the same time, early on in this same book, he talks about how the Viking way is to be glorious in the moment and to be remembered, and to not worry about what comes in the real world after you die, because once you die, it's over for you. You're not there anymore. You're in heaven or Valhalla or whatever you think happens after you die, and none of that's going to affect you anymore. And the thing is that reading this book, we all know that whatever infamy there is attached to Macbeth's name, thanks to Shakespeare, whatever infamy got spread around by Thorfinn's enemies throughout history as this rude backcountry earl who took over a whole country and booted out the people who were supposedly, better situated to have it. For all of that, his name is still spoken, and nobody knows who any of these other people are. We know who Lady Macbeth is, and we know who Lord Macbeth is, this man Thorfinn, whose name Thorfinn we never hear anymore. But we don't know about any of these other people. And the thing about this is it's an exciting and meaningful and interesting book, and it's very much the best of what this kind of genre can be. I mean, there is a reason why Dorothy Dunnett won all of the various awards that she did for writing this book. I mean, she's very much known. Now, the one thing about this book, of course, is that this is one of those very, very big books. One of the sizable, massive, dear Lord, am I ever going to finish this books, which is the reason why this particular Gwyn rambles aimlessly about real literature. That's the reason why this one is late, is because I was actually working my way through all 800 odd pages. But this is one of those books that has a little bit of everything, because it has a very touching love story. It has politicking, if that's what you're interested in. It has battles, and it has a certain amount of adventure on the high seas, and it has a protagonist who is genuinely somebody who you can call the hero of the story, even if it does end in a sort of tragedy. So, you know the story of Macbeth, but you don't know how this story fits into the greater arc of history. And so it's difficult to talk about this because, of course, this isn't a short enough book for me to give, plot points, and people will think that they know the story. But there is no crazy Lady Macbeth. And Thorfinn Macbeth, he doesn't turn into a monster by the end. He just has this sudden, sad slide caused by pure circumstance just coming all to rest on his shoulders in an unfortunate way. So that's everything that I have to say, mostly because I'm running out of time and didn't prep, so I'll see you all next week.